discipline of children is a pat on the back, long enough, hard enough, and low enough. So I've just had a pat on the back now. Thank you, my friend Jacob, for the introduction. As far as titles are concerned, I think you will have to realize that when a judge sits on the bench, advocates address him as my lord. But when you have become the one-eyed king of the blind, you are His Majesty. So there has been some increase in my stature as being a one-eyed king in the land of the blind. Werk hierdie ding? Is hy aan? It works. How about that? Thank you. Welcome, friends. Thank you for giving up a Wednesday evening to come and listen to a very, very difficult and a very complicated topic. And I don't know what went through my mind when I acceded to this request. Maybe if I had two eyes, I wouldn't have acceded to the request. I don't know. But the topic is a Christian's perspective on the South African law relating to the land issue. It's in two parts. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the constitutional implications of land and what it says and prescribes. And then I'm going to try and see what the Bible prescribes with regard to land. Much has been said and written about land restitution, land redistribution, and expropriation of land without compensation in South Africa. It has become a serious issue and a heated debate, eliciting various views and solutions. But absent a satisfactory solution, I do believe this contentious issue has the potential and capacity to turn violent and destructive to the detriment of all South Africans. So I think it is a very, very important aspect. Obtaining, therefore, a satisfactory solution is therefore imperative for our future in South Africa. At the outset, let me say plainly that I'm not a politician. In fact, I've never been a card-carrying member of any political party in my life. The purpose of this talk is not to espouse any present-day political party's views on land distribution. I merely speak to you as a lawyer and as a disciple of Jesus Christ. That is all. To comprehend the intricacies of the debates concerning property, one should have a basic understanding of the constitutional clauses dealing therewith. Now, on the screen you will see Section 28 of the Interim Constitution, Act number 200 of 1993. And it dealt with property in the following terms. Every person shall have the right to acquire and hold rights in property. You will see that I have underlined or highlighted the words rights in property, and to the extent that the nature of the rights permits, to dispose of such rights. No deprivation of any rights in property shall be permitted otherwise than in accordance with the law. Where any rights in property are expropriated, that is, when it's done by a body of the government or the municipality or whatever the case may be, pursuant to a law referred to in subsection 2, such expropriation shall be permissible for public purpose only and shall be subject to payment of agreed compensation or, in failing agreement, to the payment of such compensation and within such period as may be determined by a court of law as just and equitable, taking into account all relevant factors, including in the case of the determination of compensation, the use to which the property is being put, the history of its acquisition, its market value, the value of the investments in it by those affected, and the interest of those affected. So, that you will see before we turn to Section 25 of the present Act. I want to stress the words, it states rights in property. Remember that, because the new Section 25 deletes the first sentence of the old Act. Every person shall have the right to acquire and hold rights in property. That is deleted from Section 25 of the present Constitution. And I shall deal with that a little bit later. Now, also, it talked about deprivation of any rights in property. And there is a difference between deprivation of property and expropriation of property. So we'll have to look at that. So right, the clause that we now deal with in the present Act is Section 25, and that reads as follows. No one may be deprived of property except in terms of law of general application, and no law may permit arbitrary deprivation of property. Property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application, A, for a public purpose or in the public interest, and B, subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided or approved by court. The amount of compensation and the time and manner of payment must be just and equitable. The first one also had the words just and equitable, this one too. Reflecting an equitable balance, remember that word, between the public interest and the interest of those affected, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including A, the current use of the property, B, the history of the acquisition and use of the property, C, the market value of the property, D, the extent of direct state investment and subsidy in the acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the property, and E, the purpose of the the purpose of the expropriation. For the purpose of this section, the public interest includes the nation's commitment to land reform and to reforms to bring about equitable access to all South Africa's natural resources. That's also important because natural resources also includes mineral rights, water rights, etc. And B, property is not limited to land. And that is a new invention or a new innovation in Section 25, which we will have to deal with to understand it properly. 5, the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to foster conditions which enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. 6, a person or community whose tenure of land is legally insecure as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled, to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament, either to tenure which is legally secure or to comparable redress. 7, a person or community dispossessed of property after 19th June 1913 as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament either to restitution of that property or to equitable redress. That's also an important aspect which we will deal with. No provision of this section may impede the state from taking legislative and other measures to achieve land, water, and related reform in order to redress the results of past racial discrimination, provided that any departure from the provisions of the section is in accordance with the provisions of Section 36(1). Now, how many of you got this little book of our Constitution? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well done. Well done. At least 6 people will be able to challenge me when I say something wrong. Section 36 is the limitation clause in our Constitution. The first part of our Constitution, as you know, is the Bill of Rights. And it contains all the rights to education, to life, to property, to whatever. But none of these rights are unlimited. You cannot have unlimited rights. So that if you want to exercise your rights protected under the Constitution, in terms of the Bill of Rights, there are always limitations. And these limitations are set out in Section 36(1). But to go into that now will divert us too lengthy, and that is a whole different topic on its own. So I'm not going to deal with that any further. Parliament must enact the legislation referred to in subsection 6. So, now, that is Section 25 of the new Constitution. First of all, I want to deal with what is the meaning of property. The first noticeable difference between the old Section 28 and the new Section 25 is that the former dealt with the holding and acquisition of rights in property. Remember, I called your attention to that. Whereas the latter does not refer to rights in property, but merely states that property is not limited to land, which opens up the application of Section 25 to all kinds of property, and we'll deal with that as well. Neither Section 28 or Section 25 contain features which defines property, which says what is to be regarded as property and what is not. Section 25 provides simply that no one may be deprived of property. It does not embody any positive right to hold or acquire property as in the old Section 28. So that's rather an important difference between the two sections. It's important to consider that property has many forms, such as mineral rights, water rights, mortgages, pledges, liens, servitudes, liquor license, shares in both public and private companies, salaries, bonuses, intellectual property rights, such as royalties, bitcoins, and the like. You can go on. The definition of property today is far, far wider than the definition of property in the old Roman law. In the old Roman law, the only property that exists was animals and slaves and possibly children, which was the plus land, of course, and money. But none of these features that I have mentioned really featured in the old Roman law. It's also important for you to understand that property includes both corporeal rights and incorporeal rights, or intangible rights. What that means is this is a corporeal piece of property, and I have a right to place my hands on this piece of corporeal property. But incorporeal property are like shares or rights that come from royalties, etc. You can't touch them. They're intangible. So if we talk about property, we must always hold into focus the fact that there are corporeal as well as incorporeal rights to property, and all of them could be affected by Section 25 of the new Constitution. In fact, in a book by Professor van der Walt, he states clearly that the total value under our law today of property rights, which have no material object, is probably enormously greater than the value of such rights in all land and tangible assets. The inclusion of incorporeals in the category of resources, which can be the objects of other rights, and therefore constitute property is also in accordance with the trends elsewhere. The economic development, and especially the development of internet and information technology, have made the definition of property much wider and much more difficult to define exactly. And all of that is now included in section 25, because 25 does not specifically state where property ends and where it begins. One should also distinguish between common property, private property, and state property. Common property is found, for instance, in sectional title schemes. You know, in those people who live in complexes, the roads, etc., and the playing ground and so forth is common property. Everybody may use it that live in the complex, etc. Then, of course, there is what we call communal property. Communal property is property like in the old trust of the previous order, trust areas of the in the custodianship of the traditional leaders. They are the custodians of that communal property. And then, of course, state property, which belongs to a state organ or a municipality or any other governmental institution. Now, this wide meaning of property is the result of changes in commerce and technology, as I said. The definition of what constitutes property becomes exceedingly complicated when one considers rights generated by information technology such as internet, websites, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Other examples are whether or not electricity can be regarded as property. What would you say? Is electricity a property or not? Just think aloud. Anyone? Must be. Well, can you steal electricity? Well, if you can steal it, it must be some kind of property, surely. But the Romans didn't know about electricity, so they didn't have any prescription about the stealing of electricity. Anyway, it must be accepted that under a constitutional dispensation, where the Constitution is the highest law and not Parliament, Section 25 has effectively rendered property rights no longer absolute. And that is important. From a legal point of view, you will have to accept that property rights are no longer absolute. Now, the next point I want to deal with is the difference between deprivation, in Afrikaans is het ontneming, and expropriation, in Afrikaans is het onteiening of property. Both the old Section 28 as well as the new Section 25 distinguishes between the deprivation and the expropriation of property. Deprivation is a much wider term than expropriation. In fact, expropriation is regarded as a subtype of deprivation. Administrative action taken by any governmental institution, like a municipality or a provincial government or the national government, by the state at large, may deprive a person of the full enjoyment and use of his or her property, such as, for instance, they may close off a road for proper traffic conditions, etc. And then your right to go to your home in that street is now affected. You now have to go another route to get to your home. That's a deprivation of your right of use for that on that road. But the important thing is the same can be done also with regard to health issues. They can regulate certain uses of property for purposes of health reasons. Important to note that such administrative deprivation must be procedurally fair and be substantially justifiable in terms of the reasons furnished by the administrator or the state or the municipality or whoever to the persons whose rights have been affected. So that's why you have noticed in the past that our country has to a very large extent being governed by the courts because of review procedures that people take administrative decisions on review to a court of law for purposes of reviewing it and defining it as either reasonable or as unreasonable and therefore unjustifiable. However, it must be appreciated that such regulatory administrative limitation on the use and the enjoyment of property by the state, listen carefully, is not compensable, whereas expropriation generally is to be compensated. Shall I say that again? Deprivation of property, which is the limitation of the use of the property by government, is normally not compensable. They can do whatever is necessary for the purposes of the health of the community, for safety traffic, for whatever purposes. You can't complain if it causes you extra cost in the process. But if you expropriate, then by law and by this section, there is an initial duty to compensate. Let me go further. The simplistic explanation used to distinguish between these two concepts is that deprivation does not do away with the ownership of the land or the right or the property, whereas expropriation usually incorporates the transfer of ownership in the property to the expropriator. Now, let me give an example. You can have a servitude of a right of way on a farm. One farm wants to get to the main road and is then forced to have a right of way over the neighboring farm. That servitude limits the rights of use of the owner of that farm on that piece of land upon which a road servitude is placed. But that's not compensable. But it can be done by private treaty. But normally, if a government does that, then it will be compensable. So there's a difference in that which makes it sometimes very difficult to distinguish between deprivation of property on the one hand and expropriation on the other hand. Another example. A national ban on smoking in restaurants and theaters constitutes a limitation on the use and the enjoyment of property, but such limitation will not be compensable as it does not include the acquisition of property, but merely a deprivation thereof. Is that understood, or should I repeat it? This will be the case even if it implies that the owner of the property is to incur expenses in establishing, for instance, a separate smoking room, or he has to put in glass doors somewhere so that there's a separate portion where people can smoke, other area where people can't smoke. But that cost is not compensable because it is deprivation of property and not expropriation of property. Such deprivation is an exercise in terms of the state's police power. Remember always, a state has police power to regulate things administratively. And that's part of the police power of the state, which must be used for the general safety and health of the population. The purpose of this distinction is to enable the state to regulate the use of property for the public good without fear of incurring liability to property owners whose rights are adversely affected. That's why the distinction between deprivation of property and expropriation is very important. The dispossession or deprivation of property which results in the extinction or abatement of any existing rights held by an individual will also not be recognized as expropriation unless there is some transfer of rights to the state or the third party. Thus, the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, number 28 of 2002, which commenced on the 1st of May 2004, reformed the old rights into new order rights. Old rights into new order rights, whereby mineral rights owned by landowners were extinguished, and the state declared to be the custodian of all such rights. And you may recall that this aspect of the constitutionality of that act went to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court upheld the contention of the state that it's not expropriation. Because in those cases where people never used their mineral rights, there was no expropriation, at best only deprivation. But there was built into that act certain provisions that if you wanted to utilize your mineral rights, you had to start excavating it and using it within a certain period of time. Otherwise, your rights to your mineral rights fall away completely. So they're extinguished, but they are deprived, not expropriated. So remember the difference there. The same also occurred with the National Water Act, number 36 of 1998, as read with the Water Services Act 108 of 1997, pursuant to the constitutional guarantee in Section 27 of the Constitution that everyone has the right to access of sufficient water. So, the old property rights that we found farmers in their wills and testaments of passing land from father to son to grandson usually contained the mineral rights as well. That no longer exists. If you pass on land from father to son, there will be no mineral rights for the son. It has been extinguished by the Act. And it's now regarded as an old order act, property right. Thus, if you want to utilize mineral resources or water or one of those properties that used to be part of the old rights of land, you need to get a license for that. So if you want to start a mine, you must have a license. If you want to start something which requires water or build a dam, you need to have a license for that. The state will then empower you to do so. But you can't just go and do it on your own without the permission of the state. Now we come to compensation and expropriation. In terms of Section 25, expropriation must satisfy two additional requirements. They must be performed pursuant to public purpose or a public interest, either one, and must be accompanied by the payment of just and equitable compensation. That's what the Act says now. The amount of such compensation is either to be agreed between the expropriated and the affected individuals, or in the absence of agreement by a court of law. The considerations affecting the amount of compensation for expropriation are all listed in Section 5. Where are they now? There we are. Section 3, sorry. The current use of the property, the history of the acquisition and use of the property, the market value of the property, the extent of direct state investment and subsidy in the acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the property, and the purpose of the expropriation. All of those aspects have to be considered whether or not compensation is payable in the case of expropriation, state expropriation. Both deprivation and expropriation may only occur in terms of a law of general application. Now let me just explain that. Why does it say a law of general application? The purpose of this provision is to protect individuals from being singled out for discriminatory deprivations or expropriations, as was the case in the previous regime. This protection is further bolstered by the provision that the deprivation of property may not be arbitrary. This prevents capricious exercise of discretionary power to deprive people of poverty. A law of general application will be regarded as arbitrary if it bears no relationship to the legislative goal intended to be achieved. Let me give you an example. If a municipality closes a road purely for the convenience of the mayor of that town, so that he can reach his house easier than other people, then that will be arbitrary, because it has no relation to any justifiable reason why that road is closed, other than to benefit one individual, whereas the law says in such instances deprivation or expropriation must be in terms of a law of general application. To compare that again with the ban on smoking, that's a law of general application. Everyone has to comply with it. It's not against a single person. Everybody has to comply with it. So, now we come to expropriation without compensation. In terms of section 25.3, A to E, which is there on the board, it is possible in suitable cases that expropriation may be just and equitable without any compensation. The list of factors for consideration enumerated in subsection 3 there are not exhaustive, and all relevant factors should be taken into consideration when determining compensation. Expropriation without compensation can therefore occur in cases when the property was, for example, acquired in an inequitable manner. In the first place, or whether the state funded or subsidized the acquisition and the development of the property to such an extent that it would just be inequitable to now go and pay the original owner of that property, who did nothing with the property, any compensation. That is the equitable balance which I referred you to earlier, which must be struck when expropriation is concerned. Now, much of the debate has been about whether or not it is necessary to change the Constitution and change Section 25 of the Act. As you know, papers are full of it. The political parties are debating that issue upwards and downwards. But strictly speaking, on an interpretation of the Act as it now stands, it is quite possible to expropriate without compensation. If there's a piece of land that is vacant and is not being used by anybody or by the owner, and there is a public interest need for that property to be utilized for a clinic or a school or a hospital or whatever, and that land has been lying there vacant for, say, 100 years, then one can question whether it is appropriate for that owner, or the owner who came after the original owner, should be entitled to any compensation. If so, the amount of that compensation may be determined as so low that it almost amounts to no compensation at all. But, of course, if it's farmland that has been cultivated and it's been worked, and there's an expropriation of that kind of land, well, then that consideration will most probably lead to compensation. Now, we know for a fact that in the old trust areas, currently controlled by the traditional leaders, there are vast tracts of land which are unutilized, neither by farming or for any purpose. So strictly speaking, those types of land can be expropriated potentially without compensation. In view of these provisions, it would seem that a constitutional amendment to Section 25 is not, strictly speaking, necessary. In appropriate cases, expropriation of land without compensation may be possible. But whether such limited cases would be satisfactory to the political leaders of the day, of course, that's quite another matter. And I don't want to go into that. As I said, I'm not a politician. Let me just deal something quickly about the Land Claims Court. Pursuant to the provisions of Section 25, 6 and 7, the Restitution of Land Rights Act 22 of 1994 established the Land Claims Court. And you know where it is. It's just here down in Randburg. In addition, the Land Reform Labour Tenants Act 3 of 1996 also functions as a restitution of land law in favour of farm labourers. So farm labourers who have been on a farm for many, many years, and the farm has been transferred from one generation to the other, and they've been living on that farm with or without the permission of the owner, can, under this section, under this act, also be regarded as protected against sale or expropriation, etc. And their rights, which are then insecure, can be made more secure by the government to protect their property rights. Now, the media has reported that most of the claimants instituting land restitution claims prefer redress in the form of monetary compensation instead of restoring the land to the claimants. This entitlement is derived from the provisions of Section 6, which says, or to comparable redress, and subsection 7, which says, or to equitable redress. Under those two provisions, you can agree with the claimants. We'd rather pay you a sum of money than give the property to you. Why? Because the claimants may be people with no knowledge of farming. They may be citizens of a city, and therefore not really capable of farming. And they would rather than have equitable redress in the form of monetary compensation. That is the background of the legal position. You will note I have not referred to any political party's view on that. I have tried to limit it purely to a legal interpretation of what we see in the Constitution. Now I come to the second portion, a biblical approach to land reform in South Africa. And that's a sticky problem. That's a difficult one. In regard to any biblical approach, it is well to remind ourselves of the content of the preamble to our Constitution, which states inter alia, we, the people of South Africa, believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in diversity. May God protect our people. Nkosi sikelele Africa. God bless South Africa. In the preamble to our Constitution, God is recognized. And we as Christians must take confidence from the fact that that Constitution, with its shortcomings, it's not perfect, but with its shortcomings, also refers to the existence of God, whom we regard as our Lord and Savior. Now, it's impossible to deal with this aspect of a biblical approach exhaustively in the present circumstances while we're here, but one may indicate some pointers for consideration. And in my respectful opinion, I think we can start with the Old Testament, and we can look at Leviticus chapter 25. In that chapter, Moses prescribed to the Israelites the year of the Jubilee, which merely states that after 50 years, any property sold must go back to the original owner without compensation. We read in chapter 25, verse 10, the following: consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. That was, if you become a slave, you are then also rehabilitated to becoming a non-slave again. But also, it shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property, and each to his own clan. Verse 23 of chapter 25 says, "The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants." This is also repeated in Psalm 24, 1 and 2, which says, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world, and all who live in it. For he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." So where do we start? We start by saying that as Christians we believe the earth belongs to the Lord. And therefore we must obtain our guidance for the solving of land problems from him. These provisions that I've read to you in Leviticus also and Psalm tie up with the creation of the heavens and earth, as articulated in Genesis, where we are established to be custodians of the earth. We are stewards or caretakers acting on behalf of God. Genesis 1 verse 26 states, "Then God said, let us make man in our own image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, over livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." This stewardship is also reiterated again in Psalm 8, verse 6 to 8, which says, "You made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet. All flocks and herds and the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, all that swim the paths of the sea." So we are to rule over all of that as agents and custodians on behalf of God. This divine command is addressed to individuals, but not to individuals only. It is also addressed to governments, because we know who puts governments in place, and where do governments obtain their authority from? From the very same Creator who is the owner of the earth. So this provision should also apply to decisions made by governments regarding the use and occupation of land. We will one day have to account to the Lord for the manner in which we effected our duty as stewards of his creation. This is so because a steward does not own the property of his master, but is merely a custodian thereof. Then came the law of Moses, which is still applicable today. And we read in Exodus 20, verse 15 and 17, "You shall not steal. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." However, one must sound a note of caution in an attempt to apply in a fundamentalistic way the prescriptions with regard to land coming from the Old Testament to today. So, although the biblical principles remain relevant today, that the earth belongs to the Lord, a solution to South Africans' problems by returning property after 50 years to the original owners will be substantially problematic in its practical implication. So let's just bear that in mind. But the principle remains the same. What you own today, you don't own. You think you own it, but God owns it. It should also be remembered that the first Christians in the New Testament attempted communalism by sharing of everyone's property amongst one another. We read in Acts 4, verse 32 and 35, the following: "All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they shared everything they had. For from time to time those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was then distributed to anyone as he may need." Now, we also know, although this was very well intended to share everything amongst everybody, extreme poverty broke out amongst the Christians in the New Testament to such an extent that Paul had to travel to all the various congregations that he had established through Asia and collect money and donations to send to Jerusalem to care for the difficult circumstances under which those Christians lived under communalism. Let up. I'm not saying communism. I'm saying communalism. There's a difference between the one and the other. In communism, you are forced to give your property away. But under communalism, you freely do it out of your own free will. But it didn't work in that age of the first Christians. And so we must be careful about what we regard as sharing and what we regard as a proper and justifiable dispensation and distribution of property and land in South Africa. Realizing a fair redistribution of land in South Africa is far more complex than a simple fundamentalist application of experiences recorded both in the Old and the New Testament. Now, returning to South Africa's problems, we have to accept that forced removals of communities without compensation and the bulldozing of their dwellings constitute theft, plain and simple. There's no other way that you can describe it. The destruction of District 6 in Cape Town served no justifiable purpose other than to remove that community further away from the white-dominated community. That was the purpose. The land, which was then left vacant, was not even developed or used for any other purpose. Just has been lying there until now. When last I was in Cape Town, I saw there's a little bit of development going on there now. Similarly, the destruction of Sophia Town in Johannesburg also constituted theft of people's property. This type of state-initiated theft followed on similar conduct by the previous British colonial governments in the Cape. The first apartheid legislation in the form of pass laws were enacted in 1709 in the Cape Province, forcing all slaves to carry passes. On 27th of June, 1797, just after the British takeover of the Cape, the governor of the Cape, the first Earl George Macartney, passed a law introducing segregation by requiring all natives, that's what it said, natives, to carry internal passports in an attempt to prevent them from entering the Cape Colony. That was the germ of apartheid and segregation as far back as 1797. The injustices of the past cannot be denied. We mustn't try and fool ourselves about that. Christians should therefore be at the forefront in praying and searching for an equitable solution to the imbalances and the unequal distribution of wealth in this country. And when I say wealth, you know what I mean. It's not just land, it's more than land. As much as land grabbing by force will not produce a satisfactory solution, being complacent about the present state of affairs is equally irresponsible and unhelpful. So just sitting back and saying, well, that's how it is, I can do anything about it, I don't think that is a responsible Christian attitude to this very difficult problem. I think it is our duty and within our powers to prayerfully seek and discuss a solution which will be fair and just, provided we have open minds and hearts to seek such solution honestly, with the emphasis on honestly. God performed a miracle in South Africa on the 27th of April 1994, which has been recognized by the world and the world media, in allowing us a peaceful transition from an undemocratic to a democratic dispensation without shedding of blood. It is within His power to lead us to a similar miraculous solution to the land reform problems currently facing us. Let us comply with our biblical duty of being obedient and in submission to the government authorities established by God, as stated in Romans 3, verses 1 to 7. Let us work together with the authorities in searching for an equitable solution. We have been invited by our current president by the call, "Send me." And that's an invitation to all of us to be involved in seeking what would be a practical and an equitable solution to this very difficult problem. The church also has a prophetic voice to speak into difficult state issues where iniquity is discovered. Let us allow the Holy Spirit to lead us, as stated in Hebrews 3, verse 7. So, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. Professor J.L. Helberg concludes in his thesis that a proper Christian attitude towards land and its inhabitants is based on two pillars, namely, one, gratefulness to God for the land, and two, liberality and charitableness towards all the land's inhabitants, inclusive of foreigners. So let us consider that a homophobic attitude to foreign can also be a problem in the eyes of God when it comes to the utilization of the South African property rights that are available. Our faith in God's provision and His control of the earth should therefore be guiding our thoughts on the issue of an equitable solution to land restitution and reform. In this regard, guidance may be obtained from what is stated in John 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. His coming to this world restored the original intention of God for God Himself to live on land amongst His creation. This was the case in the Garden of Eden. This original intention was frustrated by the fall of man, but Jesus came to teach us that our relationship with God is more important than any relationship we have to land and property. Currently, we are mere strangers in a foreign country, living in tents, while we are looking forward to the new Jerusalem with foundations whose architect and builder is God. That's the portion that Jacob read us from from 1 Peter. Jesus taught us new ethical approach to our enemies, to poverty, to materialism, and to land. In regard to the latter, He said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So what, in conclusion, can we say about a Christian attitude to this vexing problem of land restitution? I don't have a solution, the snap solution. I don't think we will get to a snap solution. But I think we as Christians should make it our task to pray for those in leadership who have to come up with a practical plan which will be just and equitable to all citizens, which will create employment in a country where unemployment is rife. The unofficial figure, I think, is now 35 or 37%. The official figure is 25%. We must pray that Christians will be in the forefront of being charitable in their use of their own property, which actually is not their own property. How that is to be done, I cannot prescribe, but the Lord can prescribe. And if we conduct the search for a solution to South Africa's land problems in prayer and in action, where we are finding ourselves, wherever we may be, God will answer and create another miracle. A miracle which will prevent this country from becoming inflamed with civil war, all because of land. Because land is such an emotional issue. It's a cultural issue. It's a deep-seated element in most of the people in South Africa. And we must accept that. And we must consider their attitudes to land and property. And I say, therefore, in conclusion, let us ask Him for another miraculous solution, this time to our own land distribution problems in South Africa. Amen. Thank you. Any questions? I don't have all the answers, but you may ask questions. Yes. For transport. Correct. Well, first of all, there's vacant land within the boundaries of the inner city, which can be expropriated. And housing can be built there and be given in the form of either title deed for the property or sectional title deed, if it's a high-rising building, which we now see is happening in the center of Joburg. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's very equitable and justifiable for the purpose of allowing people who have been placed in the bundu, who have to pay so much taxi now that the petrol price has risen, and come to work to make a living, if they can live inside the city bounds. So my answer to you is yes, I think it's quite justifiable. Nog iemand? Yes. I'm sorry, I'm a bit deaf, so will you just speak up a bit? What do you think is the reply to that? What is the answer? I don't have the answer to that. But it's true, as you say. The problem with just expropriating land in an undisciplined and irresponsible manner, where there is also a financial involvement of banks who have pledged money for the purchase and the development of that property, if that is just expropriated, it will affect the whole financial industry. So it is a very complicated issue, and I don't have an answer to that. I also know that the Inyonga Trust, Yamatrus, yeah, that's right. Um, there's some inequity there as well, because one sometimes reads about traditional leaders who pay uh, for certain people to be in certain positions and demand money for people to live on certain land and pocket it without using it as a custodian, as an agent, as he's supposed to, for the development of the land. There's also that problem that the sizes of plots have either an economic or an uneconomic potential. And I'm not an expert in agriculture, but if you split up land into small plots, the possibility of developing it and making yourself a sustainable farmer is just more difficult. That's why I'm in favor, personally, for giving title deeds to people, because with the title deed, they can go to a bank, they can raise finance to start a business or to put their children through education at school or university or for whatever other purpose. But if you just occupier of traditional land, and there are vast tracts of trust land where people are just occupiers, and their right to occupation is very, very tenuous. They just have a little letter from the traditional leader or the chief saying that you can stay on this plot, and but he can withdraw that at any moment, and then those people are without accommodation. So I don't know what the answer to that is. That's something that the Lord really will have to develop for us for a proper answer. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. 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 You're quite right. It's going to take a long time, but you speak far more eloquently than I on those practical issues. And you should be in the forefront of talking to those people who have to devise this plan to solve the problem before we have any bloodshed in this land. Thank you very much for your contribution. Yeah, Maria? Yes. Mm. a land reform in the form of change of ownership or land improvement? What do you mean by? Yes. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm. Yeah, it has been centuries. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Unfortunately, you're right there. It didn't work. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Transfer of land. Yeah. Mm. Mm-mm. No, no, you're wrong. It's not idealistic. You're quite right. There's this man, Sarfontaine, you've read about him in the newspapers, who have come up with a plan in which he wrote to President Ramaphosa saying, these are the steps that we can help you with solving the problem of unemployment, poverty, land distribution, etc. And now there has been formed a committee. Well, a committee is the only way that the government can operate. But at least on that committee are people of intellectual capital, as this gentleman has said, who can think these issues through. And we must pray for them, that they come together and work out a plan where land distribution will be equitable without disrupting food production, without disrupting people's lives, etc., etc. The question asked about resettling people closer to their workplace. Well, that's sensible. There's a justifiable reason for that. Because cost of travel is immense for these people. And we put them out there in the bundu, in the old regime, and that's just not fair. That is just plain theft. Yes. No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. No, the giving of title deeds is part and parcel of passing ownership to those people who are already living on the land, sometimes for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. When I was still on the bench as a judge, I had to write a very uncomfortable judgment on what the banks do with the new Credit Act. And what happened was, you would have people in Ennerdale, in South, in Soweto, and other places, where they have bought property. They took out a bond for 20 years, and after 17 or 18 years, that was when, you remember the meltdown of economy when we had this problem? They fell in arrears with their monthly installments, which were 300, 400, 500, 600 rand per month, because he was retrenched or he was out of work, etc. And then the bank immediately clamped down, called up the mortgage bond, took hold of the property, sold it for a huge profit, and pocketed the money. And I had to say, but that is most inequitable and cannot be justified. And that was the only opportunity where I could do something about the land rights of South Africa. I wish I could have done more. But that is the type of inequality and situation that we have today. Yeah. My son, who's sitting here in the audience, did a MSc in global management and had to do with projects and so forth. And I got to do a little bit of it with him, but then I was te dom, toe ek opgehou. I couldn't go further, but he completed it. And what struck me so much about that is the use of property can be very, very effective. In the Industrial Revolution, for instance, how did the people start their businesses? They had a property. The shop was on the ground floor, and the second floor was the house. They lived there, and they traded below. That's how they started. The problem we have in South Africa is that there's a cultural need for a great majority of the people of South Africa to have a piece of land where they can worship the forefathers, and where they can slaughter cattle and or a sheep and let the blood be drained into the ground and so forth, which of course is a bit difficult if you're on the fourth story of a flat building. You can't do it there. So in that sense, there is a cultural resistance to going up. And we don't anymore have the space to go that way. So there is a cultural change that will have to take place also from that perspective, that the solution will be to go up instead of going that way. So there are emotional and social issues on both sides of the camp where people will have to make adjustments and be charitable towards one another. I saw somebody here. Yes. Now, an attorney is speaking, so please listen. He is an attorney. Mhm. Well, Louis, you are absolutely correct. That's why the one positive thing in Section 25 is that redistribution must be on an equitable, balanced basis. And that's very important. And I think we as Christians should be aware of the fact that that equitable balance is a safeguard to what you have warned against today, of an undisciplined way of expropriating land and distributing it to your buddies, and which is corrupt, and which will just be another form of theft, which occurred when Sophiatown and District 6 were plowed down by caterpillars and so forth. Ja, nog iets. Let me just, you've had a chance. Can I ask that lady? Christian, isn't it? Where the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. You're quite right. There are many white kids that are without work, that would like to have land of some sort to farm, or to develop in a block of flats or whatever they are good at. It just struck me that we should not try and bring in racism in this debate, because as soon as we talk about white and black, all the emotions come to the fore. And once the emotions come to the fore, it's very difficult to find one another. But let me just finish. If there is a situation where white people require land which is not available to them, they have a perfect right to petition the government for permission or for the right to occupy that land and to develop it if they want to. We have read in the newspapers recently that AfriForum and I think Solidarity have met with the king of the Zulus, Zwelithini. And they have now formed a sort of a bond or understanding of some sort to try and protect from this compensation, this expropriation without compensation from the Zulu land in Ingonyama Trust properties, as well as other farmlands which are cultivated by white farmers. That could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. I don't know. I hope it results in a good cooperation where a large section of Zululand, and with the assistance of white farmers, can come to an agreement for the development of underdeveloped land, like the Serfontein guy and this committee. If they can work together to find a solution where all people, white, black, pink, blue, and yellow, would have access to land if so required, would be, to me, a very just and equitable solution. And I think that's what we must pray for. But, I don't have the answer immediately because I'm not in that area. That's not my... Yes. No, there are also white squatter camps. You're quite right. No, that's right. But it should be all people who live in squatter camps should have the access to being uplifted and have adequate accommodation, adequate, with water, electricity, and sewage. And I think that if that is the first aim of this committee, that is to work together with the government, then they're on the right track. They can't do better than that. Yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Could you repeat it, please? Well, that is a topic for discussion for another day as well. But I always thought, how strange that ons boere can jump up in the air and wave their hands when a try has been scored. When they sit in church, they don't even lift a finger. There was a discrepancy there, an incongruity, which I never understood. But that's something different. Yeah. Vrystaat. let us just hear what Mario has to say. If you're right, Mario, what should our response be? If you're right, what is our response? Do you think that's a Christian response? Well, what? I thought this was about our Christian responses, but be that as my. You're quite right in pointing to the weaknesses in this whole attitude towards the land, because it's such an emotional issue, because there's a cultural issue with regard to land and the possession of land. But God has an answer. And Jesus will lead us into a miraculous solution if we pray for that solution. I always think the miracle of 1994 came about because of prayer. And I venture to say, Mario, that the majority of those prayers came from black Christians who prayed for a solution for the end of apartheid in a peaceful manner. And God answered those prayers. We now, as that lady has said, we are disadvantaged because we're white. That's fine. We can't complain because there was a time when being white was very advantageous. And now our kids and our grandchildren may suffer because of the wrongs of the past. But that those wrongs were unjustified and inexplicable, I think that goes without saying. So the purpose of discussions like this is for us to pray for a solution which will not cause any bloodshed. Adrian? Well, I think we should end now. And don't you want to come forward and pray for us, Adrian? Or do you want to stand there? thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you for your responses. And it's over to you, Pastor, to say the last word.
I just want to thank Neels for his very diligent and insightful preparation. Also the way in which he presented. I think it was a complicated issue, but it was understandable. And I think we walk away here, whether we differ or not, we will always differ, but have a better understanding of the legal side of this, which for me was some comfort, that there is a good constitution in place to work with and to base about. There's a big diversity in this country to deal with this constitution, and the great variety of gifts in our country to do this. So we're not praying for him to avoid things. We're praying that God will activate everyone with the gifting to resolve issues. And I think you ended well, Neels, with difficult questions by bringing us back to purity and by asking for purity. And may we walk away here trying, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, to follow our Lord Jesus Christ. And may God keep you and hold you to keep on contributing towards a better future for you.
But don't ask me such a difficult question again, please. I'm not up to it.